Victoria is a veterinary epidemiologist and the executive director of the University of Minnesota's Raptor Center. She leads the center's education, veterinary medicine, and research efforts on both raptors as well as larger ecosystem health topics. She comes from a One Health background addressing complex global challenges at the intersection of human, animal, and environmental health with organizations including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and the Smithsonian Institute. Victoria.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So this, I think, is my first presentation in the last 2 years to be in person. So it's so wonderful to be with everyone today. I came to the University of Minnesota in May of 2020, so it's been quite an exciting transition. So I came first, to put it lightly, I came as the Rettig Endowed Chair in Raptor and Ecosystem Health. This was a position that was completely funded from the community. And then in January 1st of this year, transitioned into the executive director role, following in the footprints of the phenomenal Dr. Julie Ponder, Dr. Pat Rettig, Dr. Gary Duke. Today, since I haven't had a chance to meet people, my hope had been to meet so many members of our community, and everyone is here today, and it's so fantastic. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on myself, so you know a little bit about where I come from, and then we're going to move into one of my most favorite topics, which is the Raptor Center, and what we're currently doing today and where we're going tomorrow. So just a brief background on myself. I am from Cincinnati, Ohio originally. And went down to Mississippi State University for all of my education, my vet degree, my master's degree, as well as my undergraduate degree. During my time at Mississippi State, had an amazing opportunity to do a lot of wildlife management research in East Africa. That was kind of an aha moment for me. I came from a passion for wildlife and conservation, but I learned that conservation was a bit of an elitist topic, right? If you can't feed your family, if you can't take care of your kids, it's really hard to care about wildlife. So from there, did a little bit of a career change. I grew up with show horses in Cincinnati, so agriculture side of things was a new adventure for me. But so much of this world depends on things like food, and as a veterinarian, it was a great option. So started going into public health work and epidemiology. So spent time with different organizations around the world, like the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, really looking on that global level of how do you help improve community health. Worked in Vietnam on things like avian influenza, huge amount of concern about that with the live bird markets, as well as on wildlife farming. And I chuckle because we were worried about diseases jumping from animals to people and causing the next pandemic. There you go. Also working in headquarters in Rome, Italy, on things like antibiotic resistance, something that impacts people and impacts animals. It also impacts our environment. Also worked with organizations like the United States Department of Agriculture, Foreign Agriculture Services, again, coming from that mindset of, can you do capacity building around animal health with the idea of you grow communities. When you grow communities, you grow the capacity to do conservation. Went over to the human world for a little bit with a 2-year fellowship with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And this is what actually brought me to the great state of Minnesota the first time. I was an epidemic intelligence service officer. These are mostly medical doctors and PhD epidemiologists. They take a few token vets, and I was happy to be a token vet there. And I was actually stationed with the Minnesota Department of Health, responding to human infectious disease outbreaks. Measles, tuberculosis, the global Zika response. This is a picture from the sole virus outbreak that happened in about 22 states. You never knew that the pet rats were coming for us, but luckily it didn't result in a lot of illness. But lots of rat testing because it was a zoonotic disease that could go to people. And I come most recently from the Smithsonian Institution, so couldn't stay away from the wildlife side of things. So it was fantastic to join the Smithsonian National Zoo. They were working to grow a veterinary epidemiology program. And coming out of applied epidemiology in people, it was very exciting. We were working to figure out how could we use data to drive better welfare of animals in human care. How could we coordinate across zoos? Zoos have a huge challenge that usually they have 1 or 2 of a species, right? It's really hard to answer questions. So how can we help coordinate across? And then also, what could we learn from captive animals to help the wild? What could we learn from wild to help the captive? Everything, if you're at the Smithsonian, you've got to work on the black and white bears. Fun story, we were doing a fertility thing to try to prove that their elderly panda couldn't get pregnant so we could stop artificially inseminating. because of the deal that they have with China to have the pandas. We almost proved that it was not worth breeding her, and then COVID calmness happened, and she popped out a baby. So that was unfortunate. But, things with elephant herpes virus causes the most mortality in young elephants, and it lets us not be able to have sustainable zoo populations of elephants, as well as work with small primates. As we learned, small primates in human care eat cultivated fruit, which has sometimes 10 to 15 times the amount of sugar that wild fruit has. So we see a lot more things like diabetes in these little guys. So basically, my whole career has been working at this complex interface, right? We know that you can't attack the big problems of the world from one sector anymore. Everything's combined. Environmental health, animal health, human health. We look at things like antibiotic resistance. We use the same drugs in people as animals, and they all get residues in the environment, right? If we're gonna attack challenges, COVID-19, wildlife can have it, domestic pets can have it, people can have it, right? So you've got to holistically look at complex challenges to really make a difference, which is exactly what recruited me back to the state of Minnesota with the Raptor Center. So the Raptor Center does this better than any place that I have been because they're so nimble and because they have such amazing animals to use as sentinels. Raptors, top of the food chain, right? We see bioaccumulation, biomagnification sometimes in these birds. They're also highly visible, so people see them and they note when they're places or they're not places. Highly mobile, birds in general, right? If their needs are not being met, they move because they're able to fly more than some species. They also don't care about country boundaries. They don't care about continents, right? They're gonna migrate, they're gonna move. They're gonna bring evidence from different areas back into other areas. So talk about an amazing group of animals that can tell us so much about what's happening with their individual as well as the whole ecosystem. So who we are today. We are first and foremost a hospital for ill and injured raptors. So founded in 1974, developing those cutting-edge surgical and medicine techniques. How do we make sure we take care of these animals? We see about 1,000 birds a year, and the majority of these birds are coming in because of human interactions, right? So not natural causes of why they're coming in. Each life has inherent worth. It's our job to try to fix them, get them back into the wild so they can be productive and thrive. Throughout that time, every bird that we see, we have the opportunity to then define new surgical techniques, new medical techniques. You always have to put, endearing pictures of some of our patients there. This little barred owl was up and on that leg way faster than we were happy with after surgery, but you can see he has a surgical fix for one of the fractures and ended up doing very well and getting released. So we're able to come up with those new techniques because we see so many birds to help better inform the whole rehab community. There's Dr. Dana, she's our medical director, and she's validating different ways to measure interocular pressure in some of our patients with that northern saw-whet owl. Other important things. Okay, so we're a little bit niche. Most organizations don't narrow quite as much as we narrow. And when you have that much expertise in one place, you gotta teach, right? We know the future for raptors relies on the best trained professionals. So we have 2 to 3 veterinary interns every year that come after their vet school year to further train and learn, as well as we're bringing back a residency program, as well as visiting veterinarians, visiting vet students, 4th-year vet students. COVID's put a little damper on that, but we've been able to go virtual, which has been very exciting. And just a note to this audience, because so many people contributed, we also now have the Lois King Fund for Raptor Medicine, Education, and Training. And this is going to let our interns and residents get so much more experience in professional development. So thank you so much to everybody who has contributed to that fund. So we fix birds, right? Important, vital work. We take broken birds, we try to get them healed and back in the wild to be productive. But we're able to have another layer of knowledge from these birds, right? We are a hospital for ill and injured raptors, but with each bird, we get a lens into what is happening in that ecosystem, right? We know the healthier the ecosystem, the better the chances for survival for all birds, as well as everything else that lives out there. So with each bird that comes in, we get a data point. We get to look into issues including lead, right? I don't need to speak about lead much to this audience, then you know the impacts, but this is a bald eagle that still had a lead pellet up in its upper GI tract, and we were essentially flushing its stomach trying to get it out so it would stop absorbing it. We test every eagle, every vulture that comes into our center for lead. 85 to 90% of the eagles have lead. A lot of them can be treatable. If they're already showing signs of that lead, we know from MRI studies that they're not going to recover. So we end up humanely euthanizing those guys. But we're able to see about environmental contamination while we're treating each patient. This is a species we consult on. We don't have here in the United States, but diclofenac's another good example. It's an anti-inflammatory drug that's often in cows that end up, when they die, getting scavenged on. Extremely fatal to vultures. So again, using raptors as an indicator. Ecosystem health, climate change, severe weather patterns. We're gonna see trends in what birds come into our center. The kestrel on the left is some thermal burns from the severe heat that we had when he came out of the nest, as well as seeing different trends after severe storms. So we're able to look at ecosystem health, climate change issues with our different trends of admissions. Emerging infectious diseases. Birds can get a lot of things that people can get too. So we're able to look into surveillance within birds to see what is out there in the environment. This was a West Nile case that we had of the eagle that came in. We know that that means it's circulating in the area that bird was recovered, the same place birders are, right? The same place we've got other mammals are. So a way to further look into what is happening. And this is where I nerd out a little bit. So microbes, right? We've got microbes that are important to live and microbes that can kill. And there's a lot of study right now on the microbiome. When we bring a raptor into our care, we're gonna change that. We feed them different, we give them antibiotics, and then we're gonna put that bird back in the environment. And our job is to do no harm. So what are we doing? What changes are we making in that bird from wild to captive? What changes are those antibiotics doing? Are we creating antibiotic resistance that we're now putting back in the wild? So the ability to look a lot at what is happening, and then how can we ultimately make sure those birds are taken care of. So what, right? That's a joke I used to have with my one of my Smithsonian colleagues, where he liked to do science, to create science, and to publish it. And I joked that I was much more the so what? What are we gonna do with it, right? And so much of science in general, it just matters so much about how we take that science and drive it to action. One huge way that we can do that is with education programming. And that's the second half of the Raptor Center. So we realized at an early age of the Raptor Center's history that you've got to go back to the public, and you've got to take the science and you have to make it accessible. And also, people take care of what they care about, right? So how do you inspire people to care? How do you tell the story of what's happening in our hospital? How do you tell the story of what the community can do to secure the future of raptors, birds, our ecosystems? Pre-COVID, did about 1,200 education programs a year. Now with digital technology, we reach a couple 100,000 people. So able to expand our reach. And we go into these classrooms and we use the charismatic ambassador birds that we have. These are non-releasable raptors that have been trained to be educators. So we're able to get into schools, we're able to talk about these issues, we're able to grab people with the live bird and then talk about some of those conservation topics someone might not stop to initially hear. So an amazing power, and the digital technology has just helped that so incredibly much. So you gotta look for the good in life, right? And COVID has driven us to not just put classic things in a digital format, but rethink how we actually come across on a digital format so that we're engaging with others. So where to next? So the Raptor Center is about to embark in its 50th anniversary in a couple of years. So there's no pressure becoming a new director of an organization right before a monumentous anniversary. But it's a great time to start planning. And in January of this year, we have a spectacular team that is ready to plan about how we go next. We have such a rich heritage and standing on the shoulders of giants before us. How do we make an even bigger impact? From the individual bird that comes in and needs our help, to how do we protect that environment and that ecosystem for all species? We'll start with some education notes. So I'd like to introduce John Samler, and he's one of our newest education manager here at the center. He comes from 16 years in the Hopkins Public School District, and I joke that he knows everybody because he taught most people's kids in that area. He also comes with a master's in conservation of birds. So kind of that great mixture of really strong educator, as well as that scientific thinking about conservation. And John, has been challenging us too of how do we take our education programming that we know is really fun and really exciting, right? People enjoy it, and take it up an even bigger level. Take it to the point that we can have measurable results of what behavior change are we trying to do and what topics are we trying to get to the public and to students. Most of our education programming right now is revenue generating, meaning it has a cost. We run all our programs at a loss to try to make sure that it's accessible to people. But we know even at a smaller cost, it's not accessible to all, and there's barriers. So a huge priority of this year is trying to make sure that we're getting to communities through grants and other opportunities that would normally not get our programming, because every kid should have the opportunity to get that awe and inspiring of raptors in the world we share, especially in a generation where kids are inside. We gotta get them outside, we gotta get them looking at nature, we gotta get them bird watching, right? Because they're gonna protect what they care about. Trying to move the education programming up a huge notch has caused amazing partnerships. John is very focused on next generation science standards, right? So how do we do programming that's fun and exciting, but also helps with those science and STEM curriculum objectives? We can use our birds to get kids to care more about science, right? And that is very exciting. In particular, we've done some pilot partnership with Cedar Creek. This is the spectacular Dr. Caitlin Potter, who's a scientist and educator out there. The Raptor Center is a little bit bound by the university. We don't quite have habitat around us. Well, don't tell the Cooper's Hawks, but not the widespread spaces. So partnering with different key partners that have amazing habitat, like out at Cedar Creek, Ecosystem Science Reserve, and bringing students there and doing paired programming. We can bring the raptors, we can bring some of that excitement, and then we can talk about those bigger ecosystem health stuff. So for example, this module was on kestrels, and we talked all about insects that they would eat. They had to go out and catch insects and get out into the environment, and then show us about food webs and how things would happen. So just really exciting options that we know we can captivate with our raptors, but now can we help teachers and can we help excite kids too about getting out into ecosystems? We've also been spending a good amount of time out in Grand Portage. So again, making sure that our programming is getting out to greater areas of Minnesota. We're trying to hit all of the elementary, middle, and high school students up in that region, especially focusing on tribal youth and getting them excited about STEM concepts. Again, using the raptor to teach adaptations or to teach predator-prey or food webs or ecology, so that we can get kids really excited about wildlife. We're also partnering with some tribal elders up in Grand Portage area to really bring the cultural side and the cultural relevance of the environment as well as raptors into paired programming to create rich experiences for tribal youth as well as all of Minnesota and surrounding areas. And what we found is that virtual technology has been key because driving 5 hours multiple times doesn't make sense. But we can now go into a classroom 6 or 7 times before we make an in-person visit. So now we're able to really do rich learning modules for teachers. Now going to our hospital, Dr. Dana Franzen-Klein is our newest medical director. She's been with us a number of years, but just took on that title, of really taking the reins of the clinic. And she's very aligned with John, questioning how can we do more? How can we reach more people? How can we learn more things? In particular, this goes along well with the lectures earlier, tracking and post-release monitoring. So we are a philanthropic-based organization. Most of our budget comes from philanthropy. And we put a lot of resources into these birds, right? And we want to make sure that those resources are well spent, and it's also important for the welfare of the birds. When we release a bird, we want it to go and thrive. Post-release monitoring and putting actual trackers on these birds is going to allow us a much better picture of what happens after we release them, instead of just relying on band returns. So really pushing of what techniques are we doing. We've got studies going on the conservation value of wildlife rehabilitation, because again, in a world of limited resources, we want to make sure that we're putting them in the right places. But then also expanding. We talked about raptors don't care about country boundaries or continents, and we've got them all around the world. And again, niche amount of expertise at the Raptor Center. So we started talks with different veterinary schools around the world, particularly probably starting in East Africa and Southeast Asia, to pair with other vet schools to do in-person as well as virtual trainings, and try to make that community too, so that we can really make sure we're supporting folks around the world. The better trained professionals, the better the hope for raptors, birds, the ecosystem. And then when you preach things enough, you eventually get asked to teach it. So ecosystem health research and training has been something that we're starting to work with a variety of different organizations on, because we can talk about that individual bird, but really if we don't protect that ecosystem, the future of that bird doesn't look very great. So really trying to teach holistically. We work with the Institute on the Environment for an ecosystem health course for undergrads. We work with vet students. It's really cool because a lot of it is just that complex interaction of One Health, right? Just trying to get professionals who graduate to understand that. So we just did it with the vet students, and they had to whiteboard. We told them, show us the system about COVID, which everyone's tired of COVID, right? But it made good fun. And everybody drew it as a veterinarian, like, this is how the disease goes. And we go, okay, now blow that up. And they went back to wet markets, and then they went back to culturally why you have wet markets and food security. And then on the other end, they went to homelessness and social services and why COVID's still spreading. And so this idea that we can get professionals to think on that scale, right? To think about, this is my piece of the pie, but this is how it fits in and how we can make a bigger impact. We're also working on a global level with a UN organization to do this on a countrywide level. So developing curriculum for frontline responders on a country governmental level to do ecosystem health. And the fun thing when we do this is you get to see really cool birds from around the world. So that's one of my favorites. And then sometimes the Raptor Center gets pulled into things that aren't quite as bird related. So the blessing of COVID is it doesn't affect birds that we know of, right? So when we're talking about transmission, you've probably seen the zoo animals have been getting it. Fortunately, we have not yet seen birds get it. But we've been involved in helping as a primary investigator on a CDC grant to look for COVID in wildlife. So wildlife rehab, where people are close to the animals. But again, it's that ecosystem health. It's the healthier the ecosystem is, the healthier it is for everything that lives in it. So the Raptor Center, we're very, very excited to start some really intensive planning about where we go next. Again, first and foremost, we care about the individual bird. That is our heritage, and that is where we are, and getting those birds successfully back into the sky. But also seizing the opportunities to learn from every single patient that comes in, to learn about what is happening in the ecosystem, to learn how we can use our education to talk about the bird, but then also to talk about people to care. Because if we don't take care of the big picture, then the individuals start to suffer. So thank you.
All right, we'll get the microphone out for any questions we might have for Victoria. A couple of hands there.
What's the latest news in lead shot and so forth, eagles and deer hunting and so forth?
Yeah, it's still there. Yep. So I mean, we're still seeing the lead come in, and historically, once upon a time, right, it was thought it was coming from waterfowl. Then that ban happened, and we saw numbers go up, not down. So pretty much leading it to deer carcasses. So ongoing work on kind of the legislative level. There's been different states in the United States that have started to ban lead ammunition. Minnesota's not one of them. And then also on the education level. So the Raptor Center is involved in some different grants and initiatives to help try to, get the lead out and to work especially at the youth level. The thing that I, as a public health epidemiologist, care about is that when you shoot a deer with lead ammunition, you get microscopic lead in the meat that you then take home and feed your family, right? And no level of lead's safe. So it's a very contentious issue, though, unfortunately. But still, I mean, you see these eagles coming in, they can't stand, they're having, blindness. Their brains are basically Swiss cheese. It's a bummer because we can prevent it.
Perhaps a little off subject, but could you make a few brief comments on COVID and white-tailed deer?
I think the question was comments on COVID and white-tailed deer, and that is very much a hot topic right now. And actually the Raptor Center with that, along with the School of Public Health, at the U was just at some of the deer check stations doing sampling in Minnesota. So what they're finding in other states is that they're finding both serology, so evidence of past COVID infection in white-tailed deer, as well as active. So they're getting PCR positives, or they're PCR positive, so recent infection. The magic question is, how are they getting infected? We don't quite know that epidemiology yet. The other question is, what does that mean for hunters and hunters' safety too? The fear has always been creating wild reservoirs for COVID. So back when I was at Smithsonian, I worked on their COVID response, and there was this incredible fear of, if it gets into wildlife, how are we going to handle it, right? One, health. It's in the environment. Can it get transmitted back to people? And those are still very much the questions. That's why we were swabbing at wildlife rehab, because we don't want to intentionally create reservoirs by releasing positive animals. But deer was an unexpected one to see the rates that they have. So that's something that a lot of work's going in. And then also our study here at the University of Minnesota's results should be forthcoming too. Everything's pending right now.
Regarding West Nile virus, and I know this fall we saw quite a few cases of raptors that I delivered to the center with eagles, especially with West Nile. Is there a correlation between the rise in West Nile among the wildlife population and also the human population?
Yeah, so blended surveillance systems are one of my favorite things, and something the Minnesota Department of Health does really well, where they track it in animals and people. We haven't created a coordinated one with West Nile yet, but it's on my list. We do things like tularemia and blastomycosis. Rabies obviously gets combined. But I think there's huge opportunities to look, especially on zoonotic diseases or diseases that can affect multiple species like people, because it's an indicator of risk, right? We know that the animal's getting exposed. That means people can get exposed.
I wanted to be sure that somebody got complimented for a very beautiful article about putting the tail back on that bird. And it was so well documented in the Star Tribune, a simple access point for all of us. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. And I think mentioning there was an article in the Star Tribune about imping.
Really
And in particular, great horned owls can get stuck in soccer nets because they don't see them at night when they hunt. And those guys usually come in with broken feathers all over. And to wait for a bird to molt could sometimes take 6 months. So we clip them off and imp on new feathers. And it's fantastic because, in this crazy world, we need a little bit of good stories, right? So having an owl get all patched up and back in the wild and be successful is something I think we all could use.
Thanks for the questions, everyone, and thanks, Victoria.